Um, so I want to welcome everyone to this second part. I want to repeat some of the thanks that I've given. First of all, to Shirley G. from the Political Science Department with the help that she gave me at the early stages of this. And I should say that this is an event which has been long in the planning. In February of last year, the planning was complete for an event to take place live and in person in November of last year. That went to the same place that every event in the world planned, that was planned for after March of last year. And so we had to make an adaptation for this, which has the one advantage that we've learned about with Zoom meetings, which is that people can come from far away who otherwise wouldn't have been able to come. And we had a former graduate student from Japan here for the last session. I see Dan Cullen here. Maybe they would have come if it was a question of coming to be here in person, but this I'm sure is easier for them. So I've mentioned Shirley G. I mentioned the Institute for the Liberal Arts. I also want to mention the Ernest Fortin Foundation, who gave moral support for this in a way which helped to prod Boston College to give material support. They've been great supporters of Bob and our program for a very long time. I won't repeat all the data that I gave to show the way in which Bob's presence has really filled what would have been just an enormous gap in our graduate program without him. I mean, it's material support and moral support. We'll be talking about his scholarly work, and I'll give a little introduction talking about some of his books and articles tomorrow afternoon. But today we're continuing, this second session, we're continuing with his former students in the graduate program. So we're going to have, first of all, Tobin Craig, who's an associate professor at James Madison College at Michigan State University. His paper is called Innovation and the Authority of Law, Notes on Bacon's Aphorismi de Jure Gentium. Sorry, the phone, of course, rings as I start to speak. And then, now my answering machine.
This is the downside of the modern technology that Bacon's science has brought.
Well, yes. Well, if only this were the only downside. And then our second speaker will be Paul Carrese, who's the director of the same organization that Peter McNamara is in, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Paul formerly taught at the Air Force Academy. He's the author of a wonderful book on Montesquieu and Blackstone and the age of, in the rise of judicial activism. And Paul's topic is restoring the case for statesmanship and for properly civic political science. Their remarks will be followed by our discussant, Nicholas Anderson, who's a fourth-year student in our PhD program. And then, as we did last time, we'll open it up for questions. I'll mention that if you have questions you want to pose, it's a little bit cumbersome doing it with a meeting this size to have people ask them in person. So if you could type them into chat, and then I can read them at the end of the session and perhaps do some editing and do them one by one. So with no further ado, I'll turn things over to Tobin for his remarks, then we'll move to Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and hello to everybody, all my friends and teachers here. It's such a delightful thing amidst the doldrums of sort of late stages COVID pandemic, to see everybody and to be here on such an occasion. It's, as everyone has said, a great honor and a real delight for me to be able to join in the celebration of Professor Faulkner's career. As we heard from Allison, who, as Peter said, put it so beautifully, one of Professor Faulkner's achievements, intended or not, is to impress his students with the possibility of a combination of qualities so rarely found together as to incline one to doubt that they cohere. A thoughtful, patient, gracefulness, taking people as they come. In my case, he had to put up with a tremendous amount. With a clear-headed, confident judgment and tough-mindedness. Speaking for myself, once you've seen this combination and benefited from it personally, you aspire to it yourself, both in your comportment and also in one's scholarly life. And so while I owe you so much, Professor Faulkner, I want to thank you for your example. As most of you here will know, I'm but one in a whole line of students of Professor Faulkner's who, inspired by his courses as well as his example, have turned their attention to the thought of Francis Bacon. Now, as we take this moment to marvel at and reflect on the range and the impact of his remarkable career, we can't fail to observe that Faulkner's focus on Bacon is somewhat curious, at least not obvious. Why, after all, Bacon? Now, Professor Faulkner can and has answered for himself. I can speak only from my own experience, albeit experience importantly shaped by Faulkner's class on Bacon and Descartes, and several readings of Faulkner's great study of the Lord Chancellor's thought, Francis Bacon, and the Project of Progress. In his books, as in his classes, Faulkner typically begins from the world of immediate concern. We today live in a world decisively shaped by the intellectual authority of modern science and the technological powers this science was designed to provide. We didn't need the pandemic to point this out to us. Boy, it sure has. Now, for someone who's really interested in understanding the distinctive features of the present, one almost cannot avoid a confrontation and engagement with the thought of Francis Bacon, or at least Professor Faulkner persuaded me. Francis Bacon and the Project of Progress, Faulkner's study of Bacon, begins and ends with the vexing problems confronting contemporary man arising from the experimental and technologically oriented science that Bacon himself called his great work. But if this is what occasions the study, the book's core, I think, is a provocative and at first blush counterintuitive argument that the new science is in fact the instrument of a new approach to morality and politics, an approach that Bacon, following and building on Machiavelli, teaches. Faulkner's book, in my opinion, has no rival as a guidebook to the key turns that constitute the path from the shores of the new continent opened up by Machiavelli to the fortress erected there by Thomas Hobbes. In the pages of this disarmingly graceful book, one encounters instance after instance of Bacon civilizing and then humanizing Machiavelli's insights, and in so doing, preparing the way for Hobbes and even Locke. If it is now fairly widely recognized that Bacon was among the first thinkers anywhere in Europe to openly and favorably cite the notorious Doctor of Italy, and that Hobbes was for a period Bacon's amanuensis, and perhaps, as Aubrey tells us, his favorite, it remains the case that even now, almost 30 years after Faulkner's study was first published, that precious little work has been done to reflect upon and inquire into these merely historical facts, and nothing comparable to Faulkner's study. In the remarks that follow, I want to pick up one small thread of the argument developed by Faulkner in that book, but I want to assure you that there are many others waiting to be followed up, and as my teacher might say, with a glint in his eye, there's much fun yet to be had. Now, in my paper, I take as my departure point Aristotle's discussion in Book 2 of the Politics of Hippodamus. Now, I presume the passage is familiar to many of you. According to Aristotle, among the elements Hippodamus's proposed regime most deserving of mention is a law concerning those who discover something useful to the city so that they might obtain honor. Aristotle initially rejects this proposal on the grounds that it will stimulate litigation and perhaps also regime change. But what is most striking about Aristotle's reflections on this proposal is his abrupt transition to, quote, another problem and a different investigation, namely whether it is harmful or advantageous for cities to change traditional laws if some other laws would be better. The answer to this question somehow relates to Hippodamos's proposal. Indeed, it apparently decides the matter. What then follows is a consideration of the apparent parallelism between the manifest phenomenon of the incremental improvements in the arts, including political expertise, and what we might call legal progress. Aristotle goes quite far in adducing the reasons and evidence against taking one's bearings from the traditional for being open to progress, but he ultimately counsels against it. Change in any law, Aristotle observes, risks the authority of all law. The strength of law to compel obedience is rooted ultimately in habit and therefore time. Established laws then should be changed only seldom, and not for small things. Now, I take Aristotle's critique of Hippodamus to be the classic statement of the imprudence of a general policy of encouraging innovation and technological innovation in particular. Indeed, to my knowledge, no significant political thinker openly argues for the political encouragement of technological innovation until Francis Bacon. Be this as it may, what recommends Bacon's writings to us, and so his thinking on this question, is his clear recognition of the force of this classic argument alongside his more famous and influential calls to embrace a new openness to innovation. Now, as is well known, throughout his career in politics and letters, Bacon loudly urges the public honoring of the inventor. Probably the most famous passage to this effect occurs in the penultimate aphorism of Book 1 of the Novum Organum, where Bacon observes, "The introduction of noble discoveries seems to rank first among human actions by a long way. And that was the judgment of ancient times, for they awarded divine honors to the discoverers of things, whereas to those of deserving in civil affairs, such as founders, lawgivers, liberators, subduers of tyrants, and the like, they appointed only the honors of heroes. And certainly, if you rightly compare the two, the judgment of those earlier times appears just." Now, we're afforded a glimpse of a political community organized in accordance with this line of thinking in Bacon's New Atlantis. In Bensalem, the highest public status and greatest civic honors are conferred upon the fellows of Solomon's house. And within that august society, the greatest discoverers and inventors win prizes and have statues erected to them. Now, one could enumerate any number of further passages to the same effect from Bacon's corpus. But Bacon did not confine himself to making this case in his writings. While in Parliament, he spoke on behalf of a policy of patent monopolies as a means of encouraging and rewarding useful innovation. I think there can be no doubt that Bacon sought to move opinion on this matter. Much less familiar, however, are passages in Bacon's writings where he acknowledges and apparently concedes the force of the classical argument against innovation, precisely on the score of the danger that it poses to the authority of law. In the Novum Organum, for instance, Bacon notes, by way of denying the charge of being an irresponsible innovator, quote, "But surely there is a great difference between affairs of state and the arts. Each faces a different danger from new development and new light. In affairs of state, change, even for the better, is suspect because of the disturbance it brings, since civil affairs rest upon authority, consensus, reputation, and opinion, not on demonstration. Whereas the arts and sciences ought to be like mines, loud on all sides with the sounds of new operation and further progress." Likewise, in the essay Of Innovation, Bacon acknowledges as, quote, "true, that what is settled by custom, though it be not good, yet at least it is fit. And those things which have long gone together are, as it were, confederate within themselves, whereas new things piece not so well. But though they help by their utility, they trouble by their inconformity." Now, almost surely the most important text wherein Bacon reveals his appreciation for the classic concern with technological innovation is his retelling and interpretation of the fable Daedalus in The Wisdom of the Ancients. What we are taught in this ancient fable, Bacon argues, is that Minos, who stands here for the laws, is essentially powerless to contain and control Daedalus, who represents the mechanical inventor. How then are we to make sense of Bacon's thinking on the problem of innovation in the law? On the one hand, Bacon is known for his loud and influential call for the establishment of a new technologically oriented science, and thus for the public funding and honoring of the inventor. And yet, he shows himself well apprised of and even able to powerfully restate the classical reservations against the open encouragement of innovation. Either he must believe that we can contain or control the effects of innovation, such that the authority of law remains intact amidst ongoing change, or he must believe that law and its authority is not so fragile, that in opening up to change, we do not expose and therefore risk undermining the authority of all law. And this implies that law has a basis, or could have a basis, more stable than Aristotle believed. So with this as my guiding question, I turn to Bacon's unpublished Aphorisms on the Greater Law of Nations, or the Fountains of Justice and Law. That the aphorisms are an important text on this question, that they may be Bacon's most revealing statement on the matter, is a bizarre claim. They are unpublished. They exist, so far as we know, in only one manuscript, which was lost and forgotten for almost 300 years. Now, I can't adequately respond to this objection here and now, beyond observing first that the aphorismi are uniquely among Bacon's writings, devoted to precisely the question at issue. Second, that Bacon elsewhere and repeatedly avows a reluctance to speak much about politics. And finally, I think there's some evidence that the view of law and innovation outlined in the aphorismi could be pieced back together from Bacon's extant published works. But the present occasion affords me one further excuse. Professor Faulkner's Francis Bacon and the Project of Progress contains one of the few really serious considerations of the aphorismi to date. And he supervised John Fortier's dissertation on Bacon's legal thought, which contains another. Though the focus of their treatments are different from my own, I think it's fair to say that they share the view that the aphorismi are among Bacon's most revealing political writings. So I turn now to a brief reading of the first half of the aphorism. And I forgive you all, this is a terribly un-Faulkner-like thing to do. I am going to comment on a text none of you will have read. The aphorismi consists of two long sections. The first of the origins and vicissitudes of law, followed by a second of the authority and obligation of laws. Finally, there's a single aphorism of those things that are not legislated. The structure of the work can thus be read as posing and presumably answering the question, what about the authority of law given the origins and vicissitudes of law, or the fact of legal change? In so doing, the work points towards a new conception of law and its relationship to the human situation, one whereby law can be opened up to change without thereby risking its authority. And it is this suggestion that I want to sketch now. We begin on ground familiar to any reader of Machiavelli's Prince. Quote, in human society, either law or force prevails. But, Bacon continues, there is also force concealed as law, and many laws that taste more of violence than of right. So there are in fact three fountains of injustice: force, malicious entrapment, and an excessive harshness of law. Thus, while the title of the work had promised us the fountains of justice, we are immediately confronted with the fountains of injustice. And this essentially negative, or as we sometimes like to say, problem-solving approach is sustained throughout. The ground or basis of law, Bacon says, is the uniting or agreement of all those whose pleasure or profit are vulnerable to the predations of others. And law, so grounded, is essentially future-directed in that it is devised in anticipation of a future danger. All, quote, public law, by which Bacon seems to refer to all those features of a political legal order that seek to discipline or order the people, flows from this law, rooted in the aggregated individual's desires to preserve their own things from loss or predation. This is so because all law requires execution, execution requires magistrates, magistrates require authority, authority requires majesty, and all public order, solemnity, and discipline requires arms, habits of obedience, excellent guards, and ordered fortification. Now enter the problem of innovation. Quote, however, the order of time and of affairs is not the same. Changes in law happen either from the intermingling of foreign customs or from internal causes in the course of time. But Bacon now suggests that only those resulting from the encounter with foreign customs are properly called innovations. This is because when the state of affairs or the circumstances change, thereby rendering a law unfit to do its work, the trouble, in fact, comes from retaining the custom or the law against the reason of time. For present purposes, I'm going to set aside the problem of novelty coming from the encounter with other practices. And I'm going to focus instead on internal causes. Bacon classifies three in particular: war or peace, wealth or poverty, and the comparative development of literature and the arts. And then he adds, as if by the way, religious change too. That's a problem. Now at this point, in the seventh aphorism, the argument pivots. And Bacon now takes up the problem of effective legal reform in response to a change of affairs. Bacon appears to take it as established that legal change is unavoidable, that change in the course of things will necessitate change in the law. He then proceeds to observe that all founders, and he makes here a distinction between founders and lawgivers, all founders have needed the support of later lawmakers precisely to perpetuate what they have founded. Why? Because circumstances have changed, necessitating legal reform so as to preserve the order that was originally established or founded. But the problem is that how do we affect that legal change? How do we impart to the new laws that were introduced so as to preserve the established order the compelling force that the original laws have? Summarizing the movement of the argument so far, things change. When things change, laws must change, for laws were made in a particular moment in response to a given set of conditions. When those conditions change, the law must either be or will either be less effective or excessively burdensome, and so will lose its source of strength. And since, as Machiavelli was fond of observing, waiting until an evil is widely recognized before responding to it leads to severe, if not futile, action, we should be regularly changing, we might say updating, our laws. But the problem is the rational basis of law on its own, that is, in the absence of the threat of loss or awareness of the inconveniences of the extra-legal situation, lacks the power to compel obedience. Only at this point does Bacon now remind the reader of the dangers or perils associated with legal change, those familiar from the Aristotle passage discussed above. He likens repeated legal change to the behavior of a sick person who, unable to find comfort and relief, is constantly trying out new remedies. Driven by illness, as it were, they introduce a new ailment and overabundance of law. Furthermore, Bacon acknowledges trampling, or we might say flouting the law, brings contempt on the doer and so cannot be tolerated. But these apparent concessions to the classical reservation against legal change are framed such that the goal of legal change is, like medicine, fending off a greater evil or danger, here called the general enervation of the laws in the body politic, which presage dissolution and death. And moreover, since Bacon declares, anticipating Hobbes, that it is better to live where nothing is allowed than where force does its will, for anarchy is worse than tyranny, we see that the concern with the multiplication of laws is at most a secondary problem. The first section of the aphorism concludes with Bacon once again repeating that time is the greatest innovator in all things, He then makes one of his characteristically delightful rhetorical turnabouts and argues that the conservative is in fact the real innovator. For quote, he who holds tenaciously to custom in the face of things, having been changed, grasps the appearance of antiquity, but is in truth embracing novelty. For what appears old can in incongruity become new. Now, the second half of the treatise develops what we might call a proto-Hobbesian doctrine of sovereignty. I recommend it to you, but I won't discuss it for the moment. Having noted this, part of what I think is particularly noteworthy about this work is the path that Bacon takes to this, what I'm calling a proto-Hobbesian doctrine. He arrives at the postulate that in all republics or commonwealths, there is a power above the laws that can abolish them and found them anew, and that this is the authority, the most just and inward cause of the power of laws. He arrives at this through a reflection on the fact of the necessity of legal change. And he reasons from this fact to what must be the case about law. But having said this, it would be mistaken, I think, to characterize the aphorismy as an inquiry into law's basis, rather than as the draft of an argument for a new conception of law and its basis. The abiding concern of the aphorismy is that law loses its power, its ability to secure obedience, when it is at odds with or out of step with the times. Of course, Aristotle would immediately concede law is general and therefore bound to be in some tension with the ever-changing and various particulars. But this is why, for Aristotle, habit and the veneration accorded to the old and established is indispensable and necessary to explain how law works. Bacon acknowledges the need for the support of habit and veneration, but seems to want to rely on it as little as possible. And so in order to do so, he recommends regularly changing the law so as to minimize the tension or incongruity between a given law and the times or the states of affairs. We don't yet get a portrait of the state of nature here, but we are reminded of the horrors of anarchy and the threat to ourselves and our goods of a situation before the law. This is how I suspect Bacon would solve the problem of giving to rationally recommended legal change the compelling force of legal change initiated in the face of manifest evil. But even allowing that his portrait of the pre-legal situation is in some part in the service of his teaching, one crucial underlying presupposition of this understanding of law is that the cosmos, what he calls the order of time and of affairs, is indifferent to humans and to the goods that they are attempting to secure by means of the law. Humans live within the rule of change, before which law is powerless and must give way, which means law has no cosmological support. But even if the extra-legal order was characterized by stable or semi-stable regularities, then, we might suppose, laws devised in accordance with nature and nature's patterns could be expected to endure. But Bacon does not speak of nature. He instead speaks of the order of time and of things. Bacon is therefore foregoing an appeal to nature and nature's stabilities as a potential help or basis for law and its authority. But behind even this stratum of the argument, there is a deeper disagreement. Bacon is totally silent here about any aim of law beyond the security of oneself and one's own goods. Law here does nothing more than to secure an order within which humans can live together. Law is not in the business, then, of teaching, of shaping souls. It is not directing humans to anything in particular. I think this is one more reason that law for Bacon can be changed more readily. That said, as the present argument has hopefully made clear, this is not to say that law as Bacon would have it doesn't convey opinions about the nature of things or the cosmos. I conclude now in emulation of my teacher by returning to where we are at the present. Our own Constitution includes a clause tasking government with the encouragement of innovation by means of rewarding and honoring the discoverers of the new and the useful. And yet that document remains venerated. On the one hand, this surely suggests that there is something to Bacon's view that we need not be so close to innovation as the ancients might have supposed. But on the other hand, those who urge constitutional reform, or even just legal change at odds with the strictures of the Constitution, will typically point to innovation, arguing that they have so altered circumstances so as to render our old laws obsolete and unfit to perform their work. If we still hesitate to fully embrace such arguments, such hesitation suggests an intuition that even when there is incongruity between the law and the times, we ought to endure the inconvenience rather than open up our laws to reconsideration. Whether this is animated by a concern to protect the Constitution's authority, or perhaps also a belief that the law being one way rather than another matters to who we are, such an intuition might lead one to want to reopen the question of just what law is for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobin. So we'll move to Paul Carrese now, and then we'll have questions or discussion from Nick Anderson, our graduate student. So Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Tobin, for that paper. It's wonderful to see all these people here. I just will mention debts to the Boston College faculty. I see here are in the earlier session with whom I studied almost 30 years ago now, starting in 1993. So again, thanks to Chris for organizing all of this. But I see David Lowenthal, who along with Bob Faulkner and Robert Cigliano served on my dissertation committee. Kay Schlossman, Mark Landy was in the earlier session, Susan Schell, and many other eminent people here and friends. I'll mention just one. I have not seen Charles Fish's visage for nearly 30 years, a long friend of Bob Faulkner's. The title of my paper, as Chris mentioned, Restoring the Case for Statesmanship and for a Properly Civic Political Science. Bob Faulkner will have to decide whether I'm honoring or dishonoring him in the following remarks, because I merge my own thought about political science with his own. In case I say anything that's overly provocative or controversial, I can always say it was actually Bob. It wasn't me, or that wasn't my thought. That was shocking. Robert Faulkner's restoration of the serious study of statesmanship and honorable ambition has contributed fundamentally to American political thought and to political philosophy as parts of political science. Still more fundamentally, his studies have pursued the argument that the late modern discipline of political science itself needs remedy or renewal. Three extremes of modern and late modern thought had turned political science toward indulgence in its own predilections, to the exclusion of genuinely understanding the political phenomena they quite confidently claim to master. Faulkner joined his mentors Leo Strauss, Herbert Storing, and other scholars in diagnosing and then standing against these developments. As a teacher and scholar, he has worked to renew an older political science, which he argued was more penetrating about the truth of human and political affairs. In his studies on statesmanship in particular, he has shown that a simultaneous advantage of such a renewed political science was that it was not, in effect, solipsistic, as the late modern alternatives tended to be, since for the most part, the reigning modes of political science have done not very much to sustain and replenish the free and decent political orders which make possible their intellectual proclivities. Indeed, Faulkner's concern was that these recent modes of political science in effect undermined liberal constitutional republics in particular, since these regimes were founded partly on an old political science as well as on the Enlightenment political science. In contrast, he sought a political science in American higher education that would do its civic duty toward the free and generally decent regime from which it benefited, while not sacrificing any capacity to seek the truth and tell the truth as one grasped it. The case of Faulkner's studies of George Washington, during decades when the drumbeat was growing that white slaveholders from America's founding era deserved not serious study by political scientists, but either denunciation or polite avoidance. This shows the intellectual but also civic virtue of Bob's approach to political science. The strength of Faulkner's argument for restoration of an alternative understanding of political science and study of statesmanship in free regimes has only grown since 2007, when he published The Case for Greatness Honorable Ambition and its Critics. This conference on his work convenes in the immediate wake of three worrying signs or symptoms about the American civic order that Faulkner's political science understands more comprehensively and arguably would have done more to prevent if widely practiced in comparison with the late modern approaches he has criticized. First, the American constitutional and civic order has endured the most populist and demagogic American presidency perhaps since Andrew Jackson's, but it also has endured the extreme measures taken by President Trump's opponents across many governing and elite institutions. Second, America has endured a sustained degree of political violence, animated by both those who are basically extreme opponents of the American constitutional order and by those who are extreme defenders as they see it. Violence of a kind not seen since arguably the decades preceding our Civil War. Neither the Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists who launched violent attacks against government buildings and officials and against citizens and property throughout 2020, nor the Trump supporters who unleashed mob violence against the US Capitol in January of 2021 understand the fundamental principles of our constitutional republic. The former act out of an antipathy largely blind, the latter largely out of a blind devotion to some concept of America they hold. The third worrying sign about America's civic disintegration is that a major cause for these first two phenomena, a demagogic president and reckless opponents, and then political violence, a major cause is the widespread civic ignorance affecting both common American citizens and powerful elites. This ignorance, in turn, is the fruit, in substantial part, of a century of an anti-constitutionalist political science that slowly gained dominance in American higher education and elite thought, and clearly has been dominant for 50 years or more. Our colleagues in the discipline of history and in other humanities and social science disciplines do share some of the blame. However, since one of America's great deficits at present is ignorance about Republican dignity and Republican virtue, we can stipulate that it is more dignified here to criticize our own discipline and to call for getting our own house in order than it is to cast aspersions on our neighboring disciplines. Further, we should adopt the proud spirit of Broadway star Alexander Hamilton, co-founder with Madison of American political science, but tempered by the more measured spirit of John Marshall, founder of the important field of American political biography. And in that blended, moderated spirit, say that political science is the superior discipline here among those that should contribute to a sound civic education, and therefore we should lead the way in reforming ourselves so that lesser modes of study might follow. So to return to the causes of America's slide into reckless demagoguery and reckless resistance and into rival extremes of political violence, the Americans who hate America and the Americans who excessively love some warped idea of it share a common root in civic ignorance. Their ignorance in part is traceable to the elite political scientists who for a century have paved the way through disregard for America's fundamental ideals, our constitutional principles and forms, and our complex constitutional history of amendment, debate, and reform. Given Faulkner's leading scholarship on Francis Bacon and modern natural science, perhaps it's fitting to suggest that the new political scientists are analogous to Dr. Frankenstein, supremely confident both of the progress to be secured by their astounding innovations and of the superiority of their understanding against the older limits and insights they discard. America faces several Frankenstein's monsters now, not only demagogic leaders, but also systemic civic illegitimacy and civic ignorance. Our current doctors are sure, however, that they had no role in causing these monsters to be abroad in the land, and that more of their new science must surely be the cure. And they're also sure there is really only one monster abroad, Donald Trump. Faulkner's renewed political science of statesmanship and honorable ambition, quintessentially in his revival of serious attention to Washington and to Marshall's Plutarchan study of Washington, exposes the thinness of most critiques of Trump's demagoguery and of America's civic decay. This is because his political science understands the proper and still plausible alternative to populism, to demagoguery, and to pure democracy. His political science also points the way to repair of America's civic foundations and fabric through constitutional understanding and conduct that teaches against any anti-constitutional and anti-republican conduct, giving no warrant to excuses that opposition to a demagogue justifies civically reckless and corrosive conduct. The next section of the paper is on the corrosiveness and myopia of America's predominant political science. I'll read just a few parts of that. As a scholar shaped by Leo Strauss's approach to political science, Faulkner's blend of a Neoplatonic and Neo-Aristotelian political science balanced attention to political philosophy per se with study of the American constitutional order more particularly. This blend allowed him to see that the American constitutional polity is in one sense an instance of modern liberal democracy or liberal democratic constitutionalism, but also is a distinctive and arguably exceptional instance of that type. The first American political science, shared by a range of thinkers from the Federalists and Anti-Federalists to Tocqueville, Martin Van Buren, and Lincoln, understood the ever-present dangers of direct democracy, of demagoguery and populism. These statesmen and thinkers knew of the history of democratic self-destruction, and they sought to prevent a repeat performance in America. Thus, our 18th and 19th century political science, that of Montesquieu, Hamilton, Madison, and Adams, which was adapted or revised as parties arose, supported constitutional forms and also civic virtues to mitigate or avoid the dangers of democratic excess and democratic self-destruction. The goal of that political science was to understand and help maintain balance in a complex, liberal, democratic constitutional order, to ensure it was both Republican and democratic, liberal and popular, sustainable and dynamic. This is precisely the constitutionalist, balanced political science that the progressive ways of political science reform since 1900 largely have repudiated. I'll note just one irony of the current political science discussion about what to do about a demagogue like Donald Trump. It's an irony that there's little recognition in our predominant political science that the gargantuan presidency created in the past century by the new political science is itself a major distorting and corroding force in the American civic order, not least given the fight to the death spirit that such a massively powerful office has fostered in electoral contests. And now a section of the paper on greatness, honorable ambition, and statesmanship, Faulkner's case for George Washington. Faulkner's political science urges political scientists to look around and notice that liberal democracies are awash with ambitious office seekers, but not with a civic understanding or a political science that can comprehensively understand, thus hope to guide such ambition. 14 years after he published The Case for Greatness, the salience of its concern to recover a political science that could help to elevate and govern ambition by harnessing it in service of a decent constitutional order should be all the more evident. Faulkner also urges us to note the paradox that democracies per se may need at crucial moments not so democratic figures to save them from disaster or to found them or to refound them. Do we currently have a political science that can understand a Churchill or a Nelson Mandela, their immense ambition, yet an understanding of why that was channeled into serving liberal democracy rather than pursuing some kind of petty or great tyranny? Faulkner argues that if we better understood Washington and the contrast to his near contemporary Napoleon, we would better understand and could better serve liberal constitutional democracy in our own day. Like Napoleon, Washington was ambitious and sought fame. Unlike Napoleon, he served causes beyond himself, decent causes beyond himself. Faulkner writes that Washington's aims were honorable and just as well as grand. Napoleon's aims were only grand. Quoting Faulkner again, but if the aims are honorable and just as well as grand, they mark a truly grand ambition, good as well as great. George Washington, the American icon, sought command in just and necessary battles, honorable fame, and the establishment of his country as an exemplar of popular self-government. So Faulkner argues that study of Washington helps us to understand that Washington had many momentous issues of justice to address in founding the independent American Republic and a durable constitutional government for it, slavery being just one among them. More fundamentally, we encounter in a new light the argument for an enduring core to human nature and to politics across millennia of change and across vast cultural differences. Faulkner argues that Aristotle's political and ethical science that seeks to foster ambition, simultaneously good and great, precisely describes George Washington. To quote him, "The first serious biography of George Washington was the American Chief Justice John Marshall, himself no mean statesman, and the character sketch that concludes Marshall's Life of Washington virtually paraphrases the ethics description, Aristotle's ethics description of the great-souled man." So we must recover the older political science that looked for and encouraged magnanimity and warned about the consequences of its absence. While a great and philosophical poet like Shakespeare can illuminate such magnanimity and statesmanship, even in its accounts of historical figures, Faulkner discerns that there is a perspicacity and an efficacy to an account like Marshall's about a statesman that the author knew well and admired for all the closeness of the knowledge about a mortal and imperfect being. Faulkner argues that the statesman, as Marshall accounts for him, is honorable and just in his or her grand ambition because working within the laws of his free country. It's important for us to see in the 21st century, such a figure is not mythical. Such statesmen have existed, and their deeds and character have been recounted by those with firsthand knowledge of such figures. To quote from Bob early in the Case for Greatness at some length here. And this captures some of Bob's spirit and style, I hope. "Greatness, resolve, a wish for the public's esteem, but governed by duty, public duty in particular, and by a height of soul that would not stoop. So Washington's magnanimity appeared to his protege Marshall and to others, Jeffersonian as well as Federalist, who knew the man firsthand. Washington seems to have been great as well as good, and good as well as great. Whereas Xenophon's Cyrus turns justice, honor, and duty into instruments of imperial ambition, Washington's ambition served justice, honor, and duty. Whereas Thucydides, Alcibiades ranges beyond his country's laws and limits toward glorious victories and empire, Washington defended his democratic republic, accepted its limitations, and framed and settled its fundamental laws. Napoleon, an authority on imperial ambition, is supposed to have lamented in exile on Elba, "They wanted me to be another Washington." Then I just want to mention that Faulkner himself worked to restore some of Marshall's understanding for our own era. Faulkner recounts that Marshall's private writings and his anxieties over decline in character among the political class in the new American Republic were at once extreme, emphasizing success, and at the other, emphasizing political righteousness. And these concerns led Marshall in the final 3 decades of his life to revise and also condense his first attempt at the life of Washington. He finally produced a 1-volume edition of the life in his final years, written for schools. The ideal of statesmanship that Marshall finds in Washington and extols to his countrymen is precisely, Faulkner thinks, what Cicero extolled, a true and wise greatness. Faulkner particularly recommends to our political scientists the closing eulogy of the life, which summarizes Marshall's theme throughout of the moral qualities that distinguish the Republican statesman. Faulkner here summarizing and quoting Marshall. "Washington exemplified the real distinction which forever exists between wisdom and cunning. Washington's were immense powers of judgment, but they were themselves subject to ends that were always upright and means that were always pure." And so just as Marshall devoted himself to civic education of his countrymen, especially in the final decades of his life, Faulkner addressed both fellow scholars, but also a broader audience. He accepted the invitation from Liberty Fund in the late 1990s to edit and bring back into print the one-volume life of Washington that had been Marshall's final project. This volume had been published posthumously in 1838, and it was quite a success. It was reprinted 20 times up until 1859 under varying titles before it fell out of favor. To borrow a Boston College phrase, that final version of the life was a Hail Mary pass into the future from a great statesman who feared for the perpetuation of the republic he had fought for on the battlefield and had helped to durably sustain through Marshall's commitment to serving in the executive branch and in diplomacy, and then famously establishing the properly intended constitutional role of the Article III judicial power. In the mid-19th century, there were American receivers, so to speak, out in the land who caught that pass gratefully. Faulkner thought it is scholarly and civic duty to assist Liberty Fund in reviving the work, redisseminating it in a way that explained its distinctive origins and purposes, and in his own voice advocating that it be used for the purpose Marshall intended, to educate his fellow Americans, and especially the politically ambitious among them. Faulkner was comfortable with the Plutarchan title of the life, a term also used by Shakespeare in his account of Henry V. Americans should know and admire the single greatest statesman of the American founding, the indispensable man who brought it more than once from fragile possibility to actual success. And it remains among the greatest privileges of my academic career that Faulkner asked me to be his junior editor working with Liberty Fund while I was his doctoral student. Faulkner's foreword to that edition is a model for any scholar asked to explain an old work on politics to a new audience, to summarize it while enticing the reader to tackle the original text, to praise the original judiciously yet moderately for a late modern audience skeptical of admiration for old white men, whether they be authors or an archaic thing like statesmen. Just to close with a few quotes of Faulkner's account of the condensed one-volume life. The life is the only published assessment of Washington's whole work in war and peace by a wise observer himself active in both. The life is the only comprehensive account by a great statesman of the full founding of the United States, of the founding of an independent people as well as of its government. There is no other concentrated history of the essentials by such an authority on American institutions. It is a historical political companion to that old Bible of American institutions, the Federalist Papers. One last quote. The life is chiefly an account of what it took to establish the new American order, and what it took chiefly was Washington. It took above all Washington's resolution, says Marshall, in war and peace, a forcefulness, deliberate and upright, but unyielding. This is the outlook that controls not only Marshall's occasional accounts of party conflict, but also his general account of the war for independence and the struggle for an adequate government. It also controls the concluding summary of Washington's mind and character, the moral and political lessons, especially for the ambitious young who are candidates for fame. And finally, since I'm at my time, I'll just mention that the final section of the paper talks about a Faulkner legacy out here in Arizona, a new department of civic thought and leadership. This is one example, I think, of the civic-minded political science that Faulkner achieved, obviously worked out to build in Boston College. We are our own department. We have our own undergraduate degrees, our own master's degree that we've just started. And it is not accidental that 3 of the founding senior faculty, including Peter McNamara and Carol McNamara, of this new department were students of Robert Faulkner.
Thank you, Paul. We'll now turn to Nick Anderson for his commentary on the 2 papers. I also want to remind you that you can submit your own questions to the panelists through the chat function, which will be easier than raising hands later on, and I'll relay the questions. So please go ahead. We do have one already for Tobin Craig, but I welcome more questions as well. So I'll turn things over to our current 4th-year PhD student, Nicholas Anderson.
Thanks. I would first like to thank Dr. Carrese and Dr. Craig for 2 insightful papers. They're a wonderful way to honor Professor Faulkner, and I hope my comments do them justice. I will briefly summarize what I take to be the major themes of each paper and then followed by a few questions for each. I will address them in reverse order. So I'll start with Dr. Carrese's paper. So Dr. Carrese argues that the current civic dysfunction in America finds its source in civic ignorance, both the contempt characteristic of the left and the resentment perhaps characteristic of the right are fostered by lack of awareness of the fundamental principles of our constitutional republic. Dr. Carrese locates a major source of this civic ignorance in the methods and orientations of the various strands of America's predominant modes of political science, which are above all characterized by excessive rationalism. The major trends in political science have, in Carrese's view, either encouraged civic disintegration or have proven irrelevant in preventing it. The inability of contemporary political science to foster civic duty has opened up the possibility of re-examining the aims, methods, and pedagogy of the discipline. Professor Faulkner's restoration of an alternative form of political science is not only superior for Carrese in an epistemological sense, since it is, quote, more penetrating about the truth of human and political affairs, but it has the consequent advantage of being able to do its civic duty in supporting the liberal constitutional republic from which it benefits. Dr. Carrese examines Professor Faulkner's restoration of statesmanship and honorable ambition, phenomena overlooked by contemporary political science, and in particular, Carrese discusses Faulkner's appreciation of George Washington to show the vitality present in this renewal of an older political science. The case of Washington's honorable ambition allows us to recognize that liberal democracies will always be filled with ambitious office seekers and provides us the hope of guiding such ambition. In contrast to the predominant political science of the day, Faulkner's political science gives us conceptual tools to distinguish between, for example, a Washington and a Napoleon, between an ambition subordinated to Republican government and an ambition that subordinates Republican government to the pursuit of its own glory, a distinction that no doubt has practical and civic consequences. Carrese stresses then the civic pedagogy of Professor Faulkner's approach, showing how Faulkner's revival of John Marshall's Life of Washington for a public audience fosters an appreciation of Washington and thus the appreciation for the honor and virtue to get the American project off the ground. Professor Faulkner's civic impact is further felt by the foundation of the School of Civic and Economic Thought at Arizona State University. So I have two sets of questions for Dr. Carrese involving what I take to be the central claim of his paper, the distinctness of Professor Faulkner's political science within the current circumstances. My first request for him is to state more precisely what sort of political science Professor Faulkner's work is restoring. There are at least two alternative forms of this renewed political science mentioned in the paper, a quote, Neoplatonic and Neo-Aristotelian political science, and quote, the political science of the American founding that prevailed from Washington to Lincoln and beyond. And I think there might even be more alternatives. But both of these alternatives seem preferable to the description of contemporary political science as presented by Dr. Carrese, yet it is not necessarily the case that these alternatives are compatible with one another. Would these alternatives, for example, agree on the natural equality of human beings? And consider also the claim in Federalist 9 that the framers of the Constitution have benefited from the improvements in science of politics that allow him to solve the problem of an extended republic. So if Professor Faulkner seeks to recover strands from both forms or from several alternatives, how does he or anyone interested in pursuing such a project address the tensions arising between these alternatives? My second set of questions deals with what could be called the relationship between theory and practice, or more mundanely, a professor's role as both a scholar and a teacher. It is argued in the paper that Professor Faulkner's political science is worth pursuing both for its intellectual clarity regarding political phenomena and for its support of civic duty. However, these things may not always be so perfectly aligned, and the pursuit of truth can sometimes be at odds with one's civic or even familial duty. Is a truly political science necessarily a true political science? So is a truly civic political science necessarily a true political science? In the particular case of America, one might argue that this insistence on a political science that fulfills its civic duty assumes the correctness of the founding principles. And so an opponent might say this merely posits its own set of ideological commitments contrary to those held by the partisans of contemporary political science. I'll turn now to Dr. Craig's paper. which addresses in its way another key strand of Professor Faulkner's work, his outstanding scholarship on Francis Bacon. In this sense, Dr. Craig honors Professor Faulkner by presenting a careful reading of Bacon's unpublished work, the Aphorisms on the Greater Law of Nations and the Fountains of Justice and Law. The question Bacon addresses in this work is the same question Aristotle addresses with the example of Hippodamus, who is perhaps the world's first political scientist, namely the relation between innovation and law. Dr. Craig argues that Bacon well understood Aristotle's critique of honoring innovation and the tendency of innovation to undermine the habitual respect necessary to support the laws of a regime. Bacon even articulates this critique in several published writings, yet Dr. Craig argues that Bacon believes he has sufficiently solved this problem through the discovery of a more stable basis for law. So one step Bacon takes in forming this novel conception of law is his negative orientation that any reader of Hobbes will find familiar. He does not begin with the fountains of right and justice, as his title makes us anticipate, but with the founts of injustice. Laws are made more to correct injuries than to secure goods. In light of this negative orientation, the ground of law is found in the desire to protect one's profit and pleasure from others. Dr. Craig's analysis then touches on the various influences internal to a political community that force the law to change. Changes in the course of things are unavoidable. Laws are made as a response to particular circumstances. Therefore, legal change is unavoidable when those original circumstances are no longer pressing. Bacon thus puts emphasis on legal reformers or lawmakers who perpetuate what the founder founded. But Bacon, knowing the classical argument well, wonders how the law can maintain its authority when it needs to be constantly changed to meet the demands of changing circumstances. Dr. Craig argues that Bacon has recourse to the chaotic extra-legal, pre-legal situation. Anarchy for Bacon is worse than tyranny. And from here, Dr. Craig also persuasively shows that Bacon reasons his way to a postulate that, quote, in all republics, there's a power above the law that can abolish them or found them anew. That is, Bacon discovers a source of authority that allows the laws themselves to undergo frequent change. So one conclusion Dr. Craig reaches is that Bacon's novel conception of law is silent about any higher end of the law beyond the security of oneself and one's goods. Bacon thinks, to quote Dr. Craig, that, quote, law is not in the business of teaching, it is not shaping souls, it is not directing humans to anything in particular. This view of law makes the law more stable in the face of change, but this endurance comes at the cost of directing citizens towards not directing citizens towards higher purposes. However, I wonder if, contrary to Dr. Craig's assertion here on behalf of Bacon, if the law shapes us whether or not it's oriented towards higher aims. The law cannot help but teach. As Dr. Craig writes, Bacon's aphorisms are not so much an inquiry into the law's basis, but the draft of an argument for a new conception of law. Is Bacon's teaching a law then that it has no business shaping souls, or is he self-consciously shaping a new conception of law for a new kind of citizen? So my second question for Dr. Craig is related and concerns Bacon's self-understanding. So he begins the work by taking the sober perspective of a legislator, as opposed to being taken in by the fancies of philosophers on the one hand and the subtleties of lawyers on the other. So to what extent does Bacon consider himself a legislator, especially considering his relation to Machiavelli, which Dr. Craig makes explicit? Is he perpetuating the work the way a legislator would a founder, or is he doing something more foundational? So for a point of reference, Bacon claims early on in the work to embark on a new and untrodden path, and states that many will recognize in these aphorisms many things of his own devising. Further, given that much of his project anticipates Hobbes, as again Dr. Craig points out, to what extent is Bacon's project reliant on future thinkers or lawmakers of sorts to alter his project according to changing circumstances? In other words, do we see in this work that the continual alteration of law becomes inseparable from the modern project? Bringing things closer to our current situation, Dr. Craig reflects on where we are at present and points to an intuition that we might want to endure the inconvenience of an incongruity between our law and the times. Such an intuition points toward an inquiry into what law is for us. Since we are to a degree the beneficiaries of Bacon's project, I wonder if we could begin that process by asking what Bacon's view of law teaches us about our own law, its foundations, and what we expect from it. So to conclude, I will ask one general question and make one comment that I think link the themes discussed in both papers. First, it seems to be suggested that the predominant strains of political science critiqued by Dr. Carrese are the intellectual grandchildren of Bacon's project. If this is true, can we expect the political science, or to what degree can we expect the political science of the American founding, which seems to constitute a different branch of the same family tree, to counter effectively the negative trends that Dr. Carrese identifies? Is there any indication that the predominant forms of contemporary political science are a continuation or consequence of certain Baconian strands within this original American political science? Second, Bacon argues in Dr. Craig's words that, quote, the conservative is the real innovator, since what appears old is in fact novel in its incongruity with the present. While Professor Faulkner may not be holding fast to custom as it manifests itself today, he's seeking to renew something old that appears on the verge of being lost. In this respect, one can conclude from these two papers that Professor Faulkner's restoration of an alternative form of political science is perhaps a form of innovation within our current circumstances. Indeed, it's a type of innovation that no healthy community can do without.
Thank you very much, Nick. And your final remark is a great gloss on our program for these 2 days. Bob Faulkner, the great innovator. I'll let Paul and Tobin respond to the questions, and then I've got a couple of questions, one for each coming from the audience. And so given the time situation we're in, I may elect to just read those two together, one after the other, and then let them both respond to them. But first, Paul, why don't you respond, and then Tobin can respond.
Sure, just quickly. Thank you, Nicholas, for those comments. On the general, I'll take one of the general questions you posed last about the nature of American political science and the American founding. So it depends, and this relates to an earlier remark you made. It depends on the nature of the improved political science invoked in Federalist Number 9. The one figure invoked there is Montesquieu. So Hobbes and Locke, Machiavelli are not invoked in the Federalist. So it hinges on the nature of Montesquieu's political science. There are some excellent recent books that have been written on that topic. One on Montesquieu as a philosopher of moderation comes to mind. So that's a great debate to be had. Is the American political science primarily Lockean, therefore maybe perhaps Hobbesian, Baconian, or is Montesquieu's improved political science itself a blending of classical, medieval, and some elements of modern political science? And that would suggest that America itself is blended. That relates to one of your questions about what is the concept of political science. I'm suggesting Faulkner, perhaps he would say, no, it's just Carrese, it's not Faulkner. What is this renewed political science? That it does have some Neoplatonic and some Neo-Aristotelian elements. Montesquieuan is the way I would combine those, and then point toward a liberal constitutional republic designed on this principle of moderation. So it's deliberately blended and balanced. It's not reducible to one big idea. Related to that, your question about the tension between the city and man, so to speak, right? Can a political science be scientific and civic? I would say that this kind of blended political science is not evading that question, but encompasses it, is aware of the tension better than the strictly modern or more radically modern political science is aware of that question. I'll stop there and let Tobin chime in.
Sure, thanks. And thank you, Mr. Anderson, for the questions. Very thoughtful. I think maybe the first to respond to the first one quickly, yes, the law can't help but teach. Therefore, and I think Bacon knows that. I think Bacon indicates it as much. And in my paper, I sort of tried to underscore that even Bacon's conception of law is implicitly teaching humans to view their situation in a particular way, and especially to view you could say the human situation in the absence of law is one of extreme vulnerability and precariousness, and so he law along the lines that Bacon imagines it being sort of regrounded would lead us to be much more keenly aware and impressed with how hostile the extra legal situation is to us and to all the goods that we care most about. I sort of joked in I think the draft of the paper that you saw, Bacon would be in favor of TV shows, lots of crime TV shows, right? Lots of, and maybe even better, like zombie apocalypse shows where every good thing humans enjoy are suddenly like put at risk and jeopardized. And he'd say, yeah, very good. That reminds people about the law and why they should listen to it. But I think maybe the one that I was most thinking about was the sort of this interesting cosmological point where Bacon doesn't make recourse to nature as a stable order, but the order of things and of the order of time and of things, which is just an arresting formulation, especially when you view it against the, in contrast or in dialogue with Hobbes. Then you ask a little bit about Bacon's self-understanding as a legislator, right? And this is a really interesting thing about this work that, within the body of the work, he distinguishes between the conditor and the legislator, the founder and the legislator. But at the outset of the work, he seems to speak on behalf of or to adopt the vantage point of the legislator. I would, not to try and be too cute, I would say he thinks of himself as the teacher of a legislator in the work. And that's the work is meant to teach future legislators and to encourage them in their activity. And then the important role of legislators, so understood, is outlined in the work. And the legislator, just to repeat what I said in the paper, is not the founder, but the legislator is the person who brings necessary change to the established laws so as to preserve the order that was originally created by the founder. And we need to celebrate such people. We need to encourage more such people, because without such people, all established orders are doomed to decay and corruption under the press of a constantly changing order of time and affairs. Now, I want to be very careful here about Bacon's project. Bacon never avows in his own name or writes in his own name a systematic treatise in which he teaches this doctrine of law. This is an unpublished fragment that's locked away somewhere. He doesn't publish this. It happens to have been found in the library that was, you could say, curated by Thomas Hobbes. I think this is a tantalizing fact that makes this document really exciting and interesting. As I say, as a potential bridge between the thought of Machiavelli on the one hand and the thought of Hobbes on the other. But you can't, I think, confidently say Bacon has as a project to teach this conception of law. I would be careful. I would be careful about drawing too much of that. It's more, I think of it more like Bacon says, well, on the one hand, that classic argument about the danger to law by innovation, there's something to be said for that. On the other hand, the goods that could be had if we could systematically encourage innovation and open ourselves up to innovation, they would be tremendous. So how could we reconceive of the relationship between law and innovation such that we could have a kind of qualified openness to innovation while nevertheless not putting at jeopardy the authority of all law and the established political order? And he tries to work this out in the aphorism. That's the reading that I'm sort of suggesting here. But he never arrives at such confidence about this framework as to, say, write a treatise to this effect. Right. The work that it most resembles is the exemplary treatise on law from the De Augmentis Scientiarum, and at the third aphorism of that, it just goes in a totally different direction, and even avows some things that are seemingly in tension with what he says in the aphorism. Then you ask about continuing change of laws being a part of modern thought, and something that I think that's right. And I think that's really underappreciated, and maybe underappreciated in America in particular. And that's what my last paragraph was sort of meant to call to our attention. We're fond of reminding ourselves of, Fed 49 about veneration and the necessity of veneration and the imprudence of regularly having constitutional conventions, right, about every element. And so but I think the general trend or tendency of modern thought, unqualified, would be something like in this direction of greater openness to change and a willingness to be constantly updating our laws. The fact that a regime such as our own, in confronting the political phenomenon, has in a certain way rediscovered the wisdom of the Aristotelian caution against over hastily changing laws, I think maybe is a kind of testament to the insight there, to the original Aristotelian insight, that, you know, when you think about what's involved in making sure a political order continues to do the works needed, you come to see that Aristotle was really right on this point. That law both teaches humans and that it also, we have to be more careful about changing it only for great goods. As far as the general question on Bacon's contribution to contemporary political science, I once was invited back to Boston College to give a Bradley lecture on this subject, in which I sort of said, yeah, Comte, that is Mill, to some extent even the founders, all avowed Baconians, ranking Bacon very high among their teachers. And so I think definitely there's something to this, but I tend to think that Bacon was much more sober, much more moderate than his heirs, who typically seem to forget important parts of the things that he teaches. So while he did much to prepare the ground for that, he was also he knew things that seem to have been forgotten. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. We've got not much time, and I've got 3 questions that are so good that I want to put all 3 of the questions out on the table. And with whatever time is left, let the panelists respond to them. So the first is from Sam Zeitlin, and this is for Tobin Craig. In aphorism 20 of the Aphorismi, Bacon writes that fear is not the strongest affect or passion, but fear is rather the most common or equal passion. I won't read the Latin quotation which he put, because I imagine Tobin knows it. What does Bacon mean when he says that fear is not the strongest, but the most equal passion or the most common passion, with all good wishes and esteem? So while Tobin is looking up the passage if he needs to and thinking about it, I'll move to a question from Tom Cleveland, and this is for Paul Carrese. You seem to argue that something like Marshall's account of Washington is indispensable for political science, insofar as Marshall himself was a practiced statesman. I think you even said Marshall is better than Shakespeare. Does a properly ordered political science require political scientists to possess such experience? What is gained by such experience that can't be gained, for example, through a serious study of history? Do non-statesmen have their own complementary insights? So first we're asked the question, is the implication of your argument that we need to go out and acquire political practice in order to be good political scientists? And then my old friend James Stoner asks another one, both to Paul Carrese and to Bob Faulkner. Among the American founders, Washington was first among equals. Part of what is so remarkable about the American founding is the cohort of founders, among whom Washington was certainly the indispensable one. But as Madison's notes make clear, our Constitution was formed not by one, but by several. Today we see many ambitious who are eager to be the one. Much of our discourse about statesmanship focusing on Churchill or Lincoln addresses outstanding ambition. What is the education that forms the several who will act together, setting aside individual ambition for the common good of the Republic, which is not a monarchy after all, is it? So we have, I think, a sentiment which will be close to the heart of a number of the political scientists in the Boston College Political Science Department. What about collaboration in political science and political practice? So we can perhaps start with Tobin on the question of this peculiar character of fear. Is it merely the most common passion and not the strongest, or in what do we make of that? And perhaps to both of you on the question of the one and the many and practices necessary to inform theory.
Thank you, Mr. Zeitlin, for the question. You're probably the only person here who's familiar with the aphorism well enough to cite chapter and verse, so to speak. Very quickly on a big question, it looks like from the aphorism, one significant way in which Bacon deviates from Hobbes is that he doesn't think that in developing this conception of law that he needs to attack and debunk the love of honor the way that Hobbes does. The context of the passage that Mr. Zeitlin calls to our attention is a call on Bacon's part for the judicious use of rewards and maybe less recourse to punishments as a way to make law more effective, and that we should think more about using rewards rather than threats all the time. And in the context of making that observation, he says, yeah, fear, of course, the most, I think he says most equal and common passion, suggests, everybody feels fear. And to some extent, the omnipresence of fear is equalizing, but not everybody's dominated or ruled by it. And therefore, there are people who are willing to risk death for the sake of honor or glory. And Bacon would say, I think Bacon would say no functioning political order can dispense with such people. And therefore, it seems to me he wouldn't follow Hobbes in taking the step that you have to attack glory loving or honor loving as potentially dangerous to establish political order. So, and it would be interesting to think about that observation together with the fact that there's no doctrine of rights in the aphorism. I think those might be connected.
And just briefly from me, thank you to Tom Cleveland and Jim Stoner, and also echoing some thoughts first raised by Nicholas. I don't think I said Marshall was superior to Shakespeare, saying that political biography as a part of a political science. Of course, Shakespeare should be a part of a political science as well, as David Lowenthal and many other great political scientists would argue. But political biography, helping to keep a political science balanced and comprehensive. As far as the need for political practice per se, I think what I was trying to argue was that Tocqueville has a phrase in Democracy in America. He's looking with the political and trying to look farther. So not imposing an abstract political science and an intellectual quest onto politics, but trying to understand the political reality and then of a particular regime as well. To Jim Stoner, the quick answer is that if properly read, Marshall's Life of Washington does not make Washington a king. Washington doesn't want to be a king or one alone, but it is to celebrate the indispensable figure, in part indispensable because he wants to bring together competing modes of thought and humors in the body politic. Just to take the example of the cabinet, to have and want both Hamilton and Jefferson in the cabinet for as long as he could keep them there, as awful as that was for Washington to have them together. But then respecting the distribution of powers in the federal government and respecting federalism. so read the right way, Marshall's Life of Washington could be something like Team of Rivals, as Doris Kearns Goodwin has done with Lincoln. But the Lincoln book would be an example of that. Probably not accidental that both Lincoln and Washington were self-read, self-made men intellectually and academically. And they knew there were more learned people out there on the scene and wanted those people around them, but also thought there was a superiority in appropriate ways of their own practical wisdom or practical judgment. And just one final thought, since we raised questions of statesmanship since Allison's paper on Thucydides and Peter on Hamilton in the first session. The remark in Thucydides book 8 that Athens never had a good form of government until very late in its self-destruction, decades into that war, suggests that Pericles, one alone, is not the right mode. Democracy is not the right mode. And Washington and Marshall, I think, give us a political science which understands that. And since we mentioned founders, are founders always innovators? Harvey Mansfield was here, so I should name him along with Bob. Bob Faulkner was sort of the shadowy figure as founder of this new department at Arizona State University. Harvey was deliberately and explicitly involved. He was asked to be on the advisory board along with Catherine Zuckert and some colleagues at the Hoover Institution at Stanford to help shape this new idea. What should this department be? So founders aren't always innovators in a Baconian or Hobbesian sense. They might be statesmen. They might be prudent, practically wise people trying to adjust enduring principles and insights to new realities.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. Alas, our time is up for this afternoon. I want to put in a plug for tomorrow's roundtable discussion. We have 4 terrific speakers and the addition of the fact that Bob Faulkner has agreed to make a few remarks at the end of the session. So you know, whatever you're doing tomorrow, tune in at 3:15 for that session. Still plenty of room to sign up for it. Again, thanks to the audience for coming. It's good to see so many of you. And thanks especially to the participants in this morning's panel and to today's panel. So thanks Tobin, Paul, and Nick for a very interesting discussion. I hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks
everyone.
for organizing.
Thank you.
Great to see everyone.
Let me add my thanks.
Oh. It's an honor.